In the years since its publication in 1984, the novel A Land Remembered by Patrick Smith has become an international bestseller. In June 2001, to celebrate a new edition of the book, I talked to the author about a time when Florida was one of America's last frontiers.
If I'd had my choice back in those days of which state to come into and expect to live a long time, I would have chosen the Wild West, because Florida was eaten alive with mosquitoes, snakes, alligators, bears, panthers, wolves, swamps, the heat. Oh, it was some kind of tough place.
Patrick Smith talks about the Florida frontier. Smith is the author of the classic novel A Land Remembered, a book that's been used in Florida's high schools for many years. Now it's been edited and abridged for younger students in a new edition published by Pineapple Press.
No one had ever attempted to put more than a century into one novel, and that one covers 110 years. It opens in 1858 and ends in 1968. And there's just so much that went on during a long period of time like that. It makes it very difficult to write because everything changes. When you start, there's no such thing as electricity. There are no automobiles. There are no refrigerators. There are no roads. You have to be very, very careful to get everything right.
A Land Remembered is the story of the McIvy family, who leave Georgia and move south, homesteading in the region around present-day Kissimmee, which Smith says is about as far south as most immigrants felt comfortable in settling.
It was the most logical stopping point for a family coming south out of Georgia the way they did in the wagon, you know. South Florida back in 1858 was just, like parts of Africa. It was just totally unknown. No one knew what was down there. Nobody lived in the interior of South Florida back then, and they just didn't want to venture any further.
Like other settlers, the McIvys live by subsistence farming and running free-ranging cattle. In researching the book, Smith says he was amazed to learn about the numbers of wild cows left over from the days of Florida's Spanish occupation.
It was a surprise to find so many herds of wild cattle in this state back in the 19th century. Free for the taking. Go out in the boondocks and the swamps and the woods and round them up. They didn't belong to anyone. They were just wild cattle. That's the main role that Florida played in the Civil War, supplying beef, tallow, hides, and salt to the Confederate Army.
But soon, in the aftermath of the war, thousands of new settlers pour into the state.
The vast majority of the people who came in here as settlers came out of Georgia, because Georgia was so torn up by that Civil War. A lot of people had lost their houses, they lost their farms, they didn't have any way to make a living, so they just packed up what they had and headed down to Florida to see what they could find down here and start a new life.
The way the novel tracks the changes in values of each successive generation of McIvys, from dirt-poor settlers to wealthy landowners, reflects the changes in attitudes of Floridians in a state evolving from wilderness to concrete.
I wanted to entertain with that novel as well as enlighten, but I did want to get across a real message about man's relationships to nature and animals and the environment. One of the things that changed so much about people over a period of time, there was a period of time when somebody would take from nature only what they needed, only. If they needed a deer to eat, they'd kill it or something like that, but they didn't go out just sport shooting and kill 14 deer, to say, hey, look what I did. And there's a scene in A Land Remembered after Zach McIvy has seen, people fighting over fences, fighting over phosphate and killing things, and he reflects and he says maybe animals are smarter than men, taking only what they need to survive. And then he says, maybe it's man who will destroy the earth and take the animals down with him. I don't want to sound like I'm preaching, but I'm just relating what the pioneer way was. They took from the land only what they needed. If you read that novel, the latter part of it gives you a pretty good blueprint on how to destroy nature. Because the last one of the McIvys, old Saul, He did it.
Patrick Smith wrote his first novel in 1953, moving to Florida in 1966. The success of A Land Remembered, Smith believes, means people have an interest in knowing more about the history of the state they live in. But has the novel changed the way we look at natural Florida?
I kind of think it has, because, I've had all kinds of people in the legislature and governors and everybody else, claim that that's their favorite novel about Florida. And I've even had a lot of developers, that love that book, and they're the kind that don't push down trees anymore. They leave them standing. And I've one time named a subdivision A Land Remembered.
Author Patrick Smith. I'm Bill Dudley. With funding from the Florida Department of State Division of Cultural Affairs, this report was produced by the Florida Humanities Council.